Let's take you back to the early 90s. Christmas Day, you opened up your shiny new Game Boy. You're super excited. Palms are sweaty. You've got your Link's Awakening. And you're 20, 30 minutes in, and you got to leave Grandma's house. The sun's going down. You get in the car, you start playing. You're like, I got an hour and a half to play as much as I want until sundown, and you can't see anything. This is a problem I'm sure all of us have always faced, and I have news for you. In 2024, there are now tons of upgrades you can make for all of your old systems. That's what we'll be discussing today. We're talking console modding. From screen upgrades to machine parts, today we'll be discussing all the mods that are out there, what our favorite mods are, and how easy it is for you to be able to do some of these. So today we're going to be going around the table, talk about who mods over here. I know I do some. Steve, do you do any modding?
Yeah, I do quite a bit of modding. I've been working on it since I was in high school. I started off with an Atari 2600. I used to follow Ben. What's his name? He used to make Ben Heck. He used to make the portable Ataris. I love following along all those journeys, and I started hacking one up only to find out I had a 6-switch Atari instead of a 4. So there was no luck in portabilizing that bad boy.
Oh, man.
I've been doing this for a long time. I got into even guitar electronics. I built guitar pedals and then eventually moved into gaming consoles. So I have some favorites. We'll discuss a number of that as we move along through the topics, but this is one that's near and dear to my heart.
Gotcha. All right, Bill, your turn. Have you done much?
Yeah, I am just a consumer of modded products, if that makes sense. I have actually played on several modded systems modded by both of you guys. So thank you for being enthusiasts in this category. I appreciate it. And obviously there's that side too, that lots of consumers out there that want these products that can now partake in Game Boy playing till any hour of the night. And Game Gear is a personal favorite of mine. It's got a super bright, awesome screen that USB-C charging. I mean, there's just a plethora of things out there that you can do with these things to make it more of a modern console or a modern, hookups, different options instead of the old find the power cable that you're not sure which one it is, things like that. So definitely great options out there. And I'm super happy that we have all these different options. So that's my history. Is I've consumed them, played them, have not gotten into the space of actually doing the work myself. Would like to at some point. Definitely have an interest. Just haven't gotten that far and confidence in my skills.
As for myself, I do a lot of handhelds. That's kind of where my focus has been. I started during COVID, actually. I was always interested in them, but just never really had time. But then you're just locked in your house and you find something to do. So I started with a Game Boy. I remember first time picking up a soldering iron, it was to put a new speaker in a Game Boy. And then I just kind of got hooked from there. Yeah, we'll be discussing a little bit, go more in depth in all of these. And there's mods that completely change the way a system operates, like a new screen for a Game Boy. There are some mods that are out there that are a small improvement and don't take away from the overall allure of the old school type technology. Because I know that there's a lot of people now that are not interested in the new fancy screens. They just want to upgrade it, recap, things like that. So there's small mods, but then there are big mods that change the overall look and functionality of a system. All right, Steve, it's your turn now. When did you start? You had mentioned, back when you were in high school, which is crazy to me because I wasn't even thinking about, I'd love to get a soldering iron and start working on some stuff. So what got you started? You said Ben Heck, but you mentioned guitar pedals too. When did your interest start?
I always kind of had a pull towards retro gaming, even before it was really retro gaming. It was still sold in EB Games and GameStop. And I saw what Ben Heck was doing, portabilizing his systems. And I remembered the days of my Game Boy and my Game Gear. And I go, wow, this is awesome. I'd love to learn how to do this. My dad had a soldering iron. So I stole his soldering iron and I started tinkering around with it. And I spent I swear, 6 or 7 hours resoldering the darn cartridge slot before I realized I had the wrong model for doing the Atari 2600. I was so mad. But after doing that, it actually gives you a lot of practice with soldering, which a lot of people get intimidated by, I find. It's not hard to start out, and it's not hard to become serviceable at soldering. You just got to be able to take feedback from others and willing to ask for that so that somebody who knows what they're looking at can give you pointers and tips. And starting out then, I got into guitar playing. I also got my dad into refurbishing and building guitars back in high school. And when we did that, I kind of gravitated towards doing some electronics. I always wanted to build my own amplifier. I never got around to that. There were kits for that at the time, but I did find that out there was schematics, kind of like sketches of what the circuit board should look like for old vintage pedals. And I wasn't paying $400 or $500 for these ridiculously old, really, really highly regarded pedals. So I was out there etching my own circuit boards. I was, buying the copper pads from Radio Shack and soldering them in. I remember I sold one on eBay, and I did this cheapo hot glue job, and it got returned because it was very amateur. Even though it looked great on the outside, I custom painted it and everything. But it kind of went through there, and I took a break for a little while. I actually studied electrical engineering in college because of my enjoyment of modding and circuits for a while before realizing that it was a lot different than I thought it was going to be, and I swapped. Yeah, I've kind of veered forward and back with modding, and I'm amazed at the amount of stuff that's out there nowadays. And I've been able to hone my skills over the years, but it really doesn't take a lot to get started.
Yeah, all it takes is just that one little bit of interest, and then it can kind of push you forward. That's exactly how I work. You find a problem you want to solve, and then you're like, okay, what do I need to learn to be able to solve that? And especially now, hopping into a build, man, you could hop into this. There's so many resources out there now. That intimidation factor, it was super intimidating for me. But just reading and get on Reddit and people, here's their experiences. I'll tell you what, still the most intimidating thing, and it's dumb. It's a stupid speaker on a Game Boy. I still have the hardest time soldering a speaker. It's 2 wires, but for some reason I can destroy board trying to replace a speaker. But then I can do other things like solder pin connectors on a custom PCB. You got to start somewhere. So Bill, because you don't have a lot of experience modding, if you could start, what would you want to do? Like if you were to have a first project, I'm putting you on the spot.
So I think I do have a soldering iron, and I've tried to replace batteries on Super Nintendo games. So I think that's another good place to start and potentially move on from there and do, go for a Game Boy Color, replace the speaker, things like that. But I guess obviously I think screens are, kind of the main allure that most people are looking at, upgrading your screen on like a GBA or a Game Gear or what have you. So I think, eventually I would really like to, obviously with like Game Boy Color, for example, there's all kinds of different colors. So, the idea would be to collect multiple systems with upgraded screens. So you got a whole arsenal in your collection type of thing. Or you can just, pick them up on the cheap, repair the speaker, drop a new screen on there, and it's a potential reselling situation to kind of fuel your funds for your collection type of thing. So there's lots of different ways you could approach it, but that's kind of where I would start, I think. Is that a fair assessment of a good place to start?
Yeah, absolutely, Bill. That's a perfect point, because everybody has games that have batteries in them if you're a retro game collector. And I tell people all the time, they're super forgiving. Start there. And a lot of people where they have problems is they don't realize what temperature to solder at. There's variable temps, or they buy an iron that's too hot and they pull a pad off, which the pad is a little copper connection on the board that's glued down. That's basically you're attaching the battery to or soldering it to. And they give up. They're like, oh, I'm done with this. I can't do this. When the reality is a couple questions and somebody be able to point you right in the right direction to where your issue is, and you move on and not have a problem. So if anybody has any modding questions out there at all, feel free to shoot us a message. We're on Facebook, Instagram, find us Retro Recall. Rom or myself will be happy to answer any of those questions, beginner or not. I love coaching beginners and helping you through it. But it's not hard to get started. It's not expensive. For $20, you can get all the equipment you need. If you want to do soldering. And a lot of those screen mods that Bill talked about, some of them are more complicated and some of them are plug and play. So not all of them require any expertise other than a screwdriver.
Even over the past 2 years, technology for the screen mods have gotten crazy. They have the laminated mods now are ridiculous. You don't even have to line up. You don't even need a bracket. You just pop it in and it's like 4 soldering points. That's it. I remember my first GBA mod, and it was intimidating because you had to do a lot of soldering and a lot of like cutting of the shell and things like that, which I'm like a bull in a china shop when it comes to like precision stuff. And I didn't do GBA mods until the laminated screen came out. Yeah, there's tons out there, from a battery replacement to a full on NES RGB mod where you have to pull the PPU out, which I don't know. Steve, have you done that? Have you had to do something like that in depth?
I mean, I've done stuff with chips and I've done hot air stations. I mean, I got it all. I've done all the type of work you'll have to do, but I haven't done every mod out there, but I've done every type of mod in terms of technique. You brought up a great point, and this really can illustrate how far modding has come. You talked about the GBA laminated screens. When GBA modding started, that's when I got into it. People were taking the backlit screens out of the GBA SPs, and they were creating these ribbon kits. And the ribbon kits would go in to convert it, whether depending on what pin style you had and which model you had. There's 2 different variants for it. You had to print out a 3D bracket or get a little piece of plastic and wedge it in there. You were hacking things up with an X-Acto knife to get it to fit right. And it was dangerous. I mean, you had to put some force. Those are pretty hard plastics. You had to be really careful doing it. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, they came out with some pre-made shells, or some of the places like Retro Modding started selling these already modded shells. And that was a huge upgrade at the time. And then before you know it, the IPS screens came out, and they came with their own 3D printed brackets. And then eventually now, like Rom's saying, you've merged all the way into the point where it's just plug and play. You plug in the ribbon cable. I don't even know if you have to do any soldering on those laminated kits, do you, Rom?
You have to if you want to be able to control the brightness, because there's a lot of like key press combos to change some stuff, like your bezel, where it says Game Boy Color, that actually changes your LED. There's an LED back there that'll change the color, but you don't have to do it. You could just throw it in and be done. Yeah,
so the old kits used to be that way too. So they haven't quite resolved that plug and play, and maybe they won't because of the button combos. You need a wire to the buttons if you want it, but you could still plug one in, have it at peak brightness, and it'll work just fine without having to do any soldering at all on those kits. They look awesome too. I mean, compared to the original one that had no backlight, it's incredible. And I found also that a lot of these new mod kits, they fix a lot of the screen tearing issues that you would see on those old LCD crystal displays. So you actually get a better quality and performance out of it, not just the backlight. There's other improvements as well. So next up, what is your favorite console mod? We'll go same order. Steve, what was your favorite console mod? You guys know I'm a big Sega guy, so I have a lot of attachment, and I know Bill's shaking his head over here. He knows what I'm going to say. It's definitely the Game Gear. I had that as a kid, love that. And if you go back to it today, the screens on it, I mean, they don't look good. They're very blurry. There's a lot of screen tearing that goes on, and the console's not producing an image that screen tears like that. I mean, they were way ahead of the time. They had there's an actual tube, just like not exactly like a CRT tube, but it's a backlit light tube behind it. So very different for the day. And the games are great. I mean, it's one of my favorite systems for handheld. There's like 200 some games on it. And the games a lot of them are ports from the old Master System games. It did really well overseas, the Master System did, but it kind of struggled in America. So they took a lot of those awesome games we didn't get here, and they ported them over. They made a bunch of original games. There's games for everybody. I'd say 2/3 of the library is great to play, at least on the Game Gear. A lot of nostalgia for me. And they've done a plethora of mods. I mean, it's been one of the more popular systems for coming out with stuff. They got brand new power boards, USB-C charging. They got batteries in there. They got like 5 or 6 different types of screen options you can add in there, including HDMI output. I mean, there's just so much stuff. New soundboards with improved sound, double the volume, cuts out all the static and junk from the sound. And then even like shells, like that's one thing. Some people are like, oh, I got to have the original shell, or I want to have a modded shell. I want to have a tricked out Game Gear. There's awesome stuff out there. They UV print, like basically, which is like melting plastic onto it. So it's like printing a plastic image that doesn't wear off easy on your shell. Or there's a lot of people that do, well, not a lot, but there's people that do custom painted shells. And I have a number of those. I have some really cool Jurassic Park ones. I probably have I have a tub that's sitting in my workshop that's probably 50 plus not working Game Gears that are sitting over there. So if you can't tell I like Game Gear, that's definitely the one for me.
It's funny. Like now, I'm working on a full Game Gear set, and the amount of Game Gears you have to buy to get because nowadays people are just selling, hey, here's my childhood collection. I probably have like 8 Game Gears now, just because I'm like, well, this is a good price, so I'll just buy it all. So I haven't I've done 2 recaps on Game Gears. But you're right, that tube looks intimidating. Like I haven't touched any of the screen stuff, but I remember opening one up for the first time. I'm like, what is going on in here? Almost like afraid to touch that thing because I'm like, tubes on an old technology, that normally means it holds a decent amount of voltage. I've stayed away from those, oddly enough, just because they're different. And I'm more of a Nintendo guy, so this is a whole new realm for me. So yeah, they're definitely a different beast.
Yeah, that's a great point about voltage. So there's a lot of people that don't work on CRT TVs, myself included, because in order for CRT tubes to work, they have to go to incredibly high voltages. And you can run into pretty high voltages on capacitors, larger capacitors on some of the power regulators in some of the consoles. So, maybe that's something we should talk about at some point here is keeping in mind safety when you are working on stuff. There's not a lot, like especially handhelds, they're all low voltage stuff. You don't have to worry on the Game Gear ROM. That one is not high voltage on that tube. It's a different design. It's not like the tubes that go to 20,000 volts or whatever it is in the CRTs. It's just a simple incandescent tube that has voltage in and voltage out. So it's a plus and a minus. It's nothing complicated and it's nothing high voltage. They basically took like a Game Boy screen that was color, and then they stuck a little tiny light behind it, low voltage light. So it's not the same as the CRT technologies of our youth.
Gotcha. Yeah, man. Forget that. I'm staying away from those. Like I have a couple CRTs that I was like, maybe I can do that, but nah, it's not worth it. I got a guy. All right, Bill. On you. What is your? My guess is you're going to be very similar to Steve, but what is your favorite console mod?
So let's just start with what I have modded. And then I'll kind of break it down of what my favorite stuff is. So I have a modded Game Gear that Steve did for me. And that's, pretty tricked out like he was talking about. New screen, new speaker, new soundboard, USB-C charging. I even took it one more level. And you know how there's just like that little tiny LED light on Game Boys, Game Gears that shows the powers on? I even changed that out to an orange one because I went with a completely orange shell. So it looks almost like a Halloween themed almost, it's all orange and then black buttons. So just silly things like that you can change out. So that's a favorite. I also have a GBA that is the original GBA, not the SP, the horizontal one that fits a little better in your hands. That SP is so tiny. So I did that, and that same thing, bright screen, new sound stuff. So it sounds just great. And that one, I really enjoy that one. It's the games on a GBA the color just pops so much. So I'm really, really happy about that one. And then the other mod I have is a NES top loader that, as some of you may know, that the NES top loader came out pretty late, but Nintendo, for some odd reason, decided to ship that thing with RF only. So it's pretty common in the modding community to mod those with a AV out, so like your red, yellow, white out. So I had a friend do that, and that's a big game changer. And I'm more of a game on CRT kind of a guy, so definitely looks a lot sharper with AV out instead of that RF. RF is so noisy and a lot of interference and stuff. So that's what I have right now. I'd like to get more. I guess what I would really like someday, being a big Sega guy as well, is a Nomad. So Nomad obviously is a portable Genesis essentially, and same exact thing with the Game Gears, right? The screens, if they're still around today, are going to look washed out and terrible. Getting a tricked out, modded, upgraded screen Nomad is kind of like the grail for me.
I have a tricked out Nomad that I did myself. I mean, I put everything in that. I got new screen. I got the triple bypass mod, which moves some of the circuitry around so that you don't get all the noise for the audio and video. So it cleans up the signals for those. And then also it enables Sega CD audio on the Nomad. So I have the Terra Onion Mega SD, which is an optical emulator for the Sega CD attachment. So I can literally play Sega CD games on my Nomad. It's pretty awesome.
That is crazy.
I didn't realize there was that much. I had an LCD Nomad, but I never used it. I ended up trading it for a CIB copy of Ninja Turtles, Turtles in Time. Bill remembers that. He's like, yep, you traded it.
It's a little bit of, I mean, that mod is not a simple mod. That's a lot of wiring. I would not recommend that as a first step. But there were some complications with creating screen mods for that. And then there was one that came out in Japan, but it was really difficult to order it because it was RGB based. But for some reason, the guy in Japan wouldn't sell outside of Japan. So in order to get it, you had to like get a fake mailbox in Japan and hope that your order didn't get canceled. And then somebody in China copied the kit, and now they're a little bit easier to get. I'm not a big fan of when in China they copy the mods and rip off people's work. Like I much prefer buying off of the person that designed it. It's going to cost more money, but it rewards the people that are out there doing this stuff for us to enjoy. But there is LCD DRV or something, but there is a screen out there for the Nomad that is awesome. The RGB is super crisp. And don't be fooled by those car modding kits that are basically like a little security camera for your car, and they take it out and they put it in there. That's the old AV connection. It's not as good as the RGB. Don't waste your time with it. Go right to the RGB screens nowadays on the Nomad.
Yeah, LCD drive, like they have the same thing for the turbos. So I think might be the same guy that did it. There's a guy that I sent my Turbo Express to. iFix Retro, I think. He's out of New York, man. I think he actually helped develop that kit for the Turbo Graphics at least. But man, it looks amazing.
So he was one of the early ones that got a copy of that kit. So that's what it was: LCD drive, LCD DRV, and then there was also the next iteration was RGB DRV. Both of those were designed by the same guy in Japan, but he wouldn't ship it out. So I know when iFix Retro got it originally, he had to do some of the finagling. I think he had somebody he knew in Japan that went and ordered it to their house and then sent the kits to him. They did make some adapter boards because the screen is very similar for the Turbo Express, and they use adapter boards, let you hook it all up and install it in there. And that's actually the other use of the LCD DRV screens is Turbo Graphics related. They look awesome there too. It's just a really good quality RGB screen. It's a shame they don't want to sell outside of Japan.
All right, so next up, what state of modding now? Like I feel every week something new's come out, something's changed, things have been upgraded. Big things now are Mr. FPGA, which I am not too knowledgeable on that, but which Steve, you might be able to attest to some of this stuff, but that is essentially hardware emulation versus just, here's a Windows machine that's running your NES emulator. It's actually emulating the physical hardware of all the systems.
Yeah, so for those that are not familiar, you probably heard that thrown around if you're in the retro gaming scene. Field Programmable Gate Array is what it stands for. So you don't really need to remember that. But basically, this is a little chips and circuitry that's rerouting signals and moving them so that they emulate physically the original hardware. So in theory, these field programmable arrays should all adjust and make the circuit, and you basically program it in, and then the hardware of it does the circuitry in itself and emulates all that. So there's a lot of people that have worked on cores, they call them, where you can download in cores for FPGA, where if you're talking Mister, where they've gotten the circuitry down. So it should, in theory, perform exactly like the original hardware. It's more, some people still call it a software emulation, like all that. It's really hardware emulation. It's not so much software emulation because it's done in these FPGA chips.
Right.
And there's a number of people that are manufacturing FPGA. There you go. Bill's holding up an analog console. That's another one. But analog is the king of FPGA consoles. I mean, they've released a number of them for Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo, original Nintendo. They just came out with the Turbo Duo. And basically all they're out there doing is creating really high quality FPGA consoles that perform exactly as the original should. Have there been a few bugs here or there? Yeah, but they do a lot of firmware upgrades and they fix a lot of that stuff. And you get crisp HDMI output on them. They also have the original AV output if you want to be on your CRT. It's just super clean, super well executed. I'm a big fan. Some people won't touch them because they're purists, but for me, if you want to play on a modern TV and you got a little bit of a budget, you're willing to spend a couple $100 or more, that's the best way to play it.
For sure. That was going to be the next thing, is the analog. Like, I personally have an analog pocket, and I just picked up the Duo, and the Duo is great. Like, I'm not too, you got Bill down here. He's like, yeah, I want a game on a CRT. I have one, but I'm still working out all the kinks with it. So like this Duo, I plugged it up to my big screen. I set it to the 4:3 ratio and went to town. Rondo of Blood looks, is it Rondo? Yeah, Rondo of Blood looks amazing on it. I'm a huge fan of it. I mean, I normally love digging into under the hood, but the FPGA stuff's a little bit above me. But all I know is that, hey, I plug in my game and it works, and I'm good. Which I was going to go kind of go back to the handheld stuff and really what Bill's talking about, the NES mods, which me personally, I've kind of stuck to the handheld stuff. Jumping off from the analog train, there's the standard type mods. Like, for example, one weird mod that I found that I actually have been building a lot of. It's not a modification to the system, but it allows you to stream your Game Boy gameplay to a PC. So if you want to record video, you want to stream on Twitch, and it's called a GB interceptor. And it's actually a piece of hardware that I actually had to send the bill of materials and the Gerber files to a PCB manufacturer to get built. And it plugs, it almost looks like a Game Genie. It plugs into your Game Boy and you pop a game in, plug in USB-C, and you could stream your Game Boy gameplay. It sounds kind of weird, but there's never been anything out there for that. It'd be cool if there was some for a Game Gear too, but yeah, you can get an emulator and stream an emulated game all day or record that. But this is actually taking the actual piece of hardware and making it to where you can display that on your computer screen. And they were doing that because Tetris tournaments, there was a requirement. You had to have that on the screen, and people wanted to play on their original hardware. So there's a guy, he's just like, yep, there ought to be a game capture device for a Game Boy. And, it's funny just taking an idea and just nowadays being able to say, you know what, I could build that. And then within 3 weeks, I could actually have this printed circuit board ready to go. And I think that's what's great about the modding technology in 2024 is the fact that you can have an idea and it's really easy with 3D printers, with PCB manufacturing. You can just take that idea and have something tangible in in less than a month than in a year or two. And that kind of brings on to like your funny playing screens and things like that, which that is a company that I believe they're China based, but they're the ones kind of leading the new mods. They came out with the laminated screen, and they're for all the handheld systems, and that's what I use. Real quick, I didn't even mention my favorite console mod. My favorite console mod, I have an original shell, the clear Play It Loud shell that I modified to fit a new IPS screen. Used the original parts, upgraded the speaker, added an audio amplifier, which I think Bill's heard it. I'm not sure if Steve, have you used any of the audio amps on the Game Boy?
Yeah, there's been a number of different iterations of audio amps.
Okay, so like it's ridiculous how loud this thing gets out of this little speaker. So I fully decked that one out with the original shell, the original membranes. The only thing is the screen was messed up, so I pulled the screen out and put in an IPS screen. And I think that's my favorite one because it retains as much of the original that you can do, but it also has the quality of life improvements. Went on a tangent, but we were talking about funny playing. So funny playing is kind of like leading as far as the handheld market. But then, of course, you've got, like Bill was mentioning, you have the NES RGB upgrade. I have one for my top loader as well. And we're going to get into it a lot more, but there's new stuff coming out I feel like every week. Just wait a couple of weeks and there'll be something new that might be interesting for you as well.
Yeah, one of my favorite YouTube modders, I'll just shout them out, Macho Nacho Productions, does super quality, in-depth overviews of it, tells you how to do it step by step. And he's pretty up on what's the new stuff coming out, and he's always doing new videos. So if you want to see what's kind of coming out, that's one good resource. The other one is Retro RGB. He does a weekly digest, and he covers all of the news, what's going on out there. So if you really want to get into this community and understand it, those are two good ones to follow.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of options out there. Steve, you'd kind of gave us some notes here. Should we walk us through like all the different actual consoles that are available to mod? I guess if anyone's out there listening that's just not sure, we've mentioned kind of the same ones over and over, the Game Gear, the NES, the GPAs. I think it'd be kind of neat to just go through this list of all the different, I mean, there's Wonder Swans on here. There's Game Boy Macros, which is like a DS thing. And then there's Atari Lynx. There's just a whole pile. Should we kind of just go over all the different ones that are available to mod out there? I think it'd be kind of cool.
Absolutely. But before we get started on that, let's do a little quick intro to modding in the sake of what do you need to mod? What does it take? And what's some general information you should know getting started? And so where I would start off is the number one thing you're going to need is a soldering iron. And I always recommend using a variable temperature. A lot of people go and buy a soldering iron and don't realize it's intended for other uses, not electric circuitry. So some of them can get really hot or they can be not hot enough. So if you start out with a variable temp, gives you a little bit more control. You also want to make sure you have the proper solder and flux. A lot of people struggle with making good solder joints, and a lot of times it's because they have no flux. They're just using the straight solder. And you get stuff from China sometimes in these kits that are, cheapo junk solder or flux. So don't be discouraged necessarily if you're having trouble getting things to flow and all that. And I'll drop a link. What's a good intro iron on our social media pages, Facebook, Instagram, etc. Come check us out there. I'll also link you to what I have. What do I use? I have a little bit nicer setup. I use a lot of Hacko products. It's a little more investment. You may not want to do that starting out. You may just want the $20 kit. It is important to know there's two types of solder out there. One is lead free and the other one is leaded solder. I personally use leaded solder all the way. It has been removed or not used as much for a lot of items due to environmental reasons. You hear about lead being dangerous, those kind of things. Well, the temperature you're soldering at is not hot enough to turn lead into an aerosolized thing. It's not so much that. You just have to wash your hands good. Be careful. Don't work on your kitchen table with leaded solder. take basic precautions and do your research too. This is not intended to be an all-encompassing thing, but I'm definitely not afraid of it. It works way better than the lead free. If you want to go lead free, that's fine. Just make sure you have a really good flux for lead free solder, because it is harder to melt, and it sometimes gives people that are just starting out trouble, and they get frustrated at it and they think it's their selves, and it's not. It's just the materials you're using, especially if you don't have a good flux for it. So I definitely recommend, if anything, picking that up. That'll let you do your basic battery replacements, any of that kind of stuff. And some of the modding doesn't even require any of those type of tools. If you really want to get further into it, hot air station is something that does come in handy, especially for surface mount components. A hot air station is basically, think of it like a little hair dryer with a nozzle. And it basically heats it up and melts the solder, and then allows you to pull components off. Now, if you're not careful, you can also blow components off of the board. So I will say it does take a little bit of practice to get good at hot air soldering. Once you have it down, though, it's very handy. And there's, especially when you move towards the newer consoles, if you really want to get into like PS3 or Xbox 360 or those kind of consoles where everything is surface mount, like an HDMI port replacement, if you want to do that, you're going to need a hot air station to really do that right. Can you achieve it with a soldering iron? Yes, but it will be very difficult to do, and you may risk ripping something up off the board doing so. So those are probably the big ones. A desoldering gun, a lot of people talk about those. So there's a lot of through hole, what they call through hole capacitors on old consoles, meaning that there's two prongs. Just think of it like plugs in your outlet that go through the board. Well, the desoldering gun, you basically put it on there, it melts the solder. You click a button and it sucks all the solder up when you're removing components. Those are handy. I don't think you need them as a beginner. You can do it the old-fashioned way with a little bit of, they call it solder wick. I would definitely recommend buying solder wick. It's very important to have that. And it's basically just a copper braid that sucks up solder the old-fashioned way. A lot of these kits come with little plastic things that are spring-loaded that can suck solder up if you put too much or you're removing a component. And a lot of the intro kits do include those. So there's a lot of different stuff you can really, if you get big into it, whether you want to have stuff that holds your circuit boards or whatever, you can get all that stuff too, but making sure you have a good workspace. And then the last thing I'll talk about is just kind of modding safety. The thing you got to keep in mind is like these flux components do aerosolize. It's not so much like if you're using leaded solder, the lead isn't at a melting point where it's going to turn into a vapor. But the fluxes and stuff have some gunk in there. And, this isn't meant to be encompassing. Please do your research on safety stuff. But you're supposed to do this in well-ventilated spaces, which typically is like outdoor or places with fans that can vent to the outside. And then also you're supposed to be doing soldering, if you can't do that, with some kind of ventilation system. So not everybody does that, but just be aware it is an irritant and it can cause, issues. So if you're going to get serious about it, it's important to consider safety and what you're inhaling there. You see the smoke, it may not irritate you, but just keep that in mind and do your research. I actually have a HEPA grade filter system that's built for soldering. So when I do soldering, it pulls it all in, sends it through a full filtering system before returning the air into my shop, since I don't have a way to ventilate it out. But a lot of people don't know that. So, there's a lot of devices out there you can buy from low end to higher end. You don't necessarily have to go with a system like what I have, but I do a lot of soldering. So yeah, it's not a lot to get started. The basic soldering kit in a well-ventilated space is plenty to get going. And then, other than some screwdrivers, it's usually good to get some security bits. They do sell pretty commonly. You can go on Amazon, pick up the security bits to open up the Nintendo security screws, and Sega use some of those on their game cartridges. Other than that, that's mostly what you'll need starting out. Bill, as you mentioned, we can go ahead and flip through this list. Maybe Ram, you want to kick us off? We're going to go one by one. We're going to start off with handheld mods, and then we'll move into consoles. And we'll just talk about some of this stuff. There's new stuff coming out all the time. You may find something new. Follow the news out there if you're wondering what's coming out tomorrow.
Gotcha. Yeah. So, we have talked a lot of Game Gear, Game Boy. Game Boy, we mentioned LCD screens. You've got your IPS mods, or just backlight. I mean, you can go in and just get a vibrant board, which is a pain because you have to. Have you ever done a vibrant? I mean, you've got to pull off. There's like a polarizing film that you have to pull off of that screen, and you can really, really mess up your stuff if you do it wrong. So I've done one or two, but I just go straight to the IPS. So that's called a vibrant mod. You got your audio shells. Like you mentioned, you have so many painted shells. There's the options are endless because now you have people that can actually they have their own molds and they make their own. There's a ton of things you can do as far as just upgrading the aesthetics, because sometimes you might have yellowing on your screen, or not on your screen, but on your actual plastic. You can upgrade that. You can get rechargeable battery mods. And that's kind of like the case for most of these handhelds. And then now they have complete upgrades, like new PCBs and everything. I was just looking at the Macho Nachos. Someone it's building a new Game Boy, and you literally just replace all the parts with a new PCB. So it goes from super small to super major that requires a lot of soldering work and things like that.
Yeah, so like Rom said, and there's been a lot of evolutions to the modding. You talked about the bivert mod. For those that are wondering what that is exactly, think about just sticking a light behind your LCD screen and lighting it up that way. And it basically, like, there is a polarizing film that allows you, just like your sunglasses, allows you to see the LCD crystals from the right angle, so it looks right on the screen. So you peel that off. You have to glue on the back of the glass panel a new light, and then solder that in for power. And that's basically, and then you put a new polarizing film on the back so it shows up properly. That's the old school way of doing it. The new way is IPS. You hear IPS everywhere. There are two main screens out there. There's IPS, TFT, two different technologies, but they're pretty similar. I like the IPS versions personally better, but you will see some TFT ones out there. So just two different technologies. So don't be overly concerned on that. Do your research if you want to get one of the two. And then the other thing to keep in mind too is a lot of these consoles are getting older. You are going to run into end of life type components. And one of the things keeping retro gaming consoles alive, and I'll mention these for units, what are the common things that go bad? Capacitors is a big one. Capacitors are basically, they store a charge to build the voltage for the circuit board. And a lot of these capacitors have a design life amount of hours, and they're 30, 40 years old now. Some of them have had a long life or not stored well. And the Game Boy doesn't have a lot of capacitor failures at this point in its life. They were pretty good capacitors, but I have run into a few here and there. So keep in mind that that's not really modding. That's basic upkeep of your console if you need to change out components like capacitors. And that's common to a lot of them. Game Gears, pretty much all of them are dead now. So if you get a Game Gear and it doesn't work and you find it at a garage sale, that's not surprising because the capacitors are almost always bad in those. So we'll touch on a little more of that. And there's some things to keep in mind also with CD drives and other consoles of that nature. But capacitors will be a thing. Don't be afraid to get them replaced. It's not, changing the, console if you're a purist. It's really just about keeping it running for the long haul.
Yeah, and kind of moving on from that, like which is why you get, like I mentioned earlier, why we get, if you buy a lot of 10 Game Gear games, they're going to throw the Game Gear in with it because they're like, yeah, audio doesn't work or screen doesn't work or things like that. So, and that's a good way to start if you're getting into it. I was going to say, Bill, if you want to get going, that's what you should do. Your first thing, just replace all the caps on the Game Gear. That'll get you. That'll get you going because there's like 13 total, and you've got different types of caps that you have to replace. And
for me, I don't recommend beginning with the Game Gear. Yeah, you can start with a Game Gear. The only thing I'm going to say is because they have so many cap failures, what happens is the electrolytic fluid that's in those leaks out and creates corrosion on the board. So you got to be extra delicate with them. So if you're just starting out and getting a feel for it, I have seen so many people just rip the solder pads off of things accidentally. And so it requires a little more finesse on the Game Gears, and you need to be very diligent about cleaning and removing all that fluid. So I prefer I prefer through hole type cap replacements as a starter, just because they're a little more surefire. They're easy. Once you get the solder off, you can pull it out, drop a new one in, solder back to it. You don't have to worry about the surface mount components where you're ripping pads off and all the electrolytic nasty fluid.
Yeah, man, I guess that I just went head first then, because I bought the surface mount, the ceramic caps to replace my in my, because you get by the ceramic kit, right? I think there was maybe 2 or 3 of the prong mounted ones.
Yeah, just
I guess
on the
maybe I
power
just
button.
had good luck.
Yeah, and you can. I mean, some are more degraded than others, but I've seen that happen a lot with people starting out and trying to do the Game Gear, and then they get frustrated and quit on modding because of
That
that.
bad experience for the first, yeah.
What do I do? This thing came off, this copper thing. What do I do now?
We send it to Steve. That's what we do.
You could solder to other places. It's not uncommon to have to do trace repairs on Game Gears, which is something that you don't want to do as a entry level. And when you run into weird issues on Game Gear, they're not complicated. I just recommend you practice like a little bit of soldering and get your technique down, and then move into the Game Gear. And then they're like moderate beginner, I'll call them.
Okay. See, I guess my experience could have been very different if I would have had one of those that you had. Now, I have a Xbox console that I tried to repair that had that same issue with the leaky caps on the power. And so I know what you're talking about, and it's disgusting. It's like it was all over. It was terrible. And so I closed it back up, and it's still sitting. It's sitting right over here actually, because I didn't want to deal with it.
Yeah, that's a known issue on the original Xbox as well. You know, Game Boy, pretty safe for the most part there. They also have a lot of consoleizer kits out there for these. So the Game Boy has them, Game Gear has them, where if you want to get the video and audio out on your TV and hook it, some of them you can even hook up a controller with and play it on the TV. Some people like that. Some of them are more complicated than others. I know, like the GBA consoleizer, that's a complicated soldering ribbon. You don't want to start off there. But a lot of the screen replacements on Game Boy are just a plug and play solution. There are a number of them. I mean, you don't have to solder wires like the GBA version ones. You can solder them for the extra controls. Game Gear is not a plug and play solution. It is not one I recommend doing the screen replacements for unless you know how to solder, because you have to solder the ribbons down to the small pins, and that's very frustrating. I get frustrated by it. I don't think they're the perfect design just yet out there, but they're not easy per se. They're not the worst thing or most complicated thing, but definitely not. I wouldn't call them beginner level for the screen mods. And there's nothing wrong with hiring somebody to do this too if you don't feel comfortable doing it. And then the other thing you mentioned too is, I guess they have a new board out there for the Game Boys. This is becoming one of the new trends I've noticed in retro gaming. Basically, they re-engineer the original circuit board, and then you just drop all new components in there and steal the chips that are unique to the Game Boy that make it work and transfer them over. Or they have the same thing with the Game Gear, the SYF. They've created and reverse engineered a number of the boards, and you can buy those. And if you have a dead Game Gear that's absolutely destroyed by cap fluid, you can buy the board and then transfer it. Now, that's a very difficult mod because you got to be able to remove a chip, which is hot air desoldering. But for some people out there, if you've done it before, you like modding, you may find some fun or the challenge of that. I have a kit for it. I've been meaning to do at some point. You'll find out even with some of the bigger consoles, they're coming out with those too. We'll talk about when we get to the regular consoles.
Right, and you're talking about the consoleizer. There's a Game Gear consoleizer too. I'm not sure if you mentioned that just a minute ago, but yeah, I've been very interested in potentially getting one of those. Moving on, kind of, we were talking about like custom hardware as far as like the innards, the circuit boards and stuff, but there are also shells that are like completely machined out of aluminum. So I have a couple Boxy Pixel unhinged, which essentially takes a Game Boy Advanced SP and turns it into almost looks like a Game Boy Color. So you have your Game Boy Advance that's the horizontal, like Bill was mentioning. Well, this turns it into basically kind of like what an old DMG or a Game Boy Color, and DMG is like the original Game Boy. Dot matrix gaming is what DMG stands for. These are completely machined parts out of aluminum, and so you've got some heft to them. And I've made 2 of them myself, and it just kind of gives it that premium feel when you pick it up. I mean, it weighs about double what a Game Gear, sorry, not a Game Gear, but a Game Boy Advance weighed, and it just kind of gives it that, I don't know, just a shiny look. And that also does an LCD replacement as well. And they're pretty costly, but it like I said, if you want to show off and bling out your Game Boy, definitely those are the ones to get.
Yeah, and keep in mind with the boxy pixel shells, they are absolutely beautiful. They are, I mean, milled aluminum. They're anodized with a coating that basically colors them, but they're very expensive. Be prepared to spend. Don't get sticker shock at $100+ shell, because that's what you're getting into there.
That's just a shell, and then you've got to buy the IPS screen and the buttons. So you're looking $200 without owning an SP. And I bought one I made one for myself, and I was like, all right, I'll just make another one and I'll sell it. Man, people look, they're like, you're crazy. I get that a lot. So
keep your budget in mind when you're doing modding stuff, because you can spend, even like some of the tricked out plastic shells that are just like UV printed on. They're not terrible. I mean, you can buy them for $20-$30. I mean, that's reasonable for most people's budget, but Epoxy Pixel is definitely a high-end product. There are some high-end products. These consolizer kits are not typically cheap for most of these systems. So, think about that. There's a lot of sound upgrades. You get louder sound out of your handhelds. There's a lot of power improvements. I do like a lot of the power ones because technology has improved on power regulation over 30 years. So I do often consider power improvement boards. It just depends on the console. Some are plug and play, some have some soldering, but most are pretty straightforward.
I would say on the budget piece. Yeah. I mean, good point, Steve. I would say, plan on between $100 and $200, no matter what system you're like a handheld, whatever one you're going to upgrade. By the time you buy parts, by the time you buy the old system, because we're taking old systems and upgrading them to essentially a new product. You're using the motherboard. Yeah, it's definitely keep the budget in mind. And yeah, that boxy pixel, man, that's like the Rolls Royce. Like, I feel like maybe someday, but it's like, yeah, you get sticker shock on that, but it's all good. So I don't know, I feel like we should move on to some consoles. We have a big list here of all the different console options and just kind of briefly go through each one.
Well, before we jump onto that, so other consoles you're going to find stuff with for handhelds. The WonderSwan has screens. We've got the Atari Lynx. They have screen mods. And FYI, if you have an Atari Lynx and it won't power up, there are some power circuitry issues on that one. And they have rebuild kits for them. They're not very easy to do if you're not experienced in soldering. Seek somebody out to do that. But I've done all that myself. A common problem. The Turbo Expresses, PC Engine, GT as it's called in Japan, those also have backlit screens, region mods. They are known for capacitor failures, just like on Sega Game Gear. So be expected for lots of damage, and capacitor replacement should be assumed if it has not been done on those units. The Nomad, they have the triple bypass, new screens. They even have a new one that's like an all-in-one board. It's pretty hard to come by. It has the screen built in. It's got a battery built in. It replaces the whole subboard on the thing. And it's basically an all-in-one encompassing mod. Pretty cool to see if you can find one. And then the Neo Geo Pocket, they also have a lot of screen mods. So some of these less popular consoles that weren't big in the US, or even if you want to import the Japanese consoles, you can find mods, and there's lots of region patches and stuff for the Japanese games. The community's growing. You'll find more and more. If your favorite console is not on this list, there may be some stuff out there, or there may be more out there. With that, we'll move on to consoles.
I haven't done many of the consoles, but you have a Sega CD. You've got your Fram mod and your BIOS mods, which maybe Steve, the Fram mod, that's going to be your save stuff, right? Like basically onboard saving.
So with consoles, you're going to find, I'll give you a quick overview. You're going to find a couple different mods that are pretty common to a lot of them. A lot of old consoles use save batteries, kind of like your games did. So the Sega Saturn is an example of that. You can change that save chip from a battery style to an FRAM, which is non-battery backed up flash memory. So that's one that's done. It's not a super easy mod, but you find that on Sega CD too. There's some other consoles as well that use those type of batteries. It's basically the little coin battery cells in there. The other common things you'll find is they're called ODEs, optical disc emulators. So if you have a CD-based console, a lot of them have optical disc emulators. It basically replaces your CD drive, and it will allow you to boot backups of your games from an SD disk. So you don't have to have the CD drive. Your CD drive's failing. You want to swap it out and you don't want to go CD. That's a common one that's out there. The other one is HDMI. They're slowly but surely, we're getting either RGB kits, which are RGB is the outputs from the console that provide, much more clear signal. Red, green, blue, if you ever see those plugs, RGB out to your TV. They also have HDMI upgrades for a lot of these as well. We can get crisp 1080p. They're basically pulling the RGB signal off the board, the digital signal, and they're converting it and sending it on out, direct out the console. They're not easy mods to do, but you'll find them. Power supply upgrades. There's a number of those. You can replace the power supplies out there where basically they've re-engineered and created a new power supply board. Some of them even run off of USB, which is interesting, instead of the old big blocky chargers. The one thing I will caution you on if you're considering doing the power mods for your console, just because it's new doesn't always mean it's better. There are some consoles that have very, very good power regulation design, like Sony on the original PlayStation 1. That thing is an awesome power supply. I personally would probably just recap one of those as opposed to replace it, because I think it's better than the new replacements are. So not everything new is always better. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the newer, but power regulation is a pretty particular thing. So these little tiny boards versus the giant boards you had before. Now, when you're dealing with consoles, you're dealing with high voltage a lot of times on these old ones. So you got 120 volts coming in, and some of those voltages get stepped up on the power board. So you do need to be considerate of the fact that you don't want to touch a live power board. You don't want to shock yourself. You should discharge capacitors on the big capacitors on ones that have 120 volts coming into them. So that's like your old PlayStation boards where you're plugging directly with two prongs right into the back of the console, and then all the power drop from your outlet is going in the console. If you have the power brick where it says 9 volts output, that means you have 9 volts going in the console, and all that high power conversions happening on that brick itself, as opposed to inside the console. So just one thing to keep in mind out there, definitely do your research on it. Make sure you figure out, is there high voltage on this? Do I need to discharge capacitors? Discharging capacitors is not hard to do. It's just a matter of crossing the two lines and grounding them. It doesn't take long to do, but it'll avoid a shock that could be, injuring. Don't be scared of it. Just do your research. It's easy to do these things safely. It's not like the CRTs where you got 20,000 plus volts going through them, but you still can hurt yourself on the high voltage stuff. So, keep in mind, a lot of the old power supplies, there are ones that need recaps. So expect that to be occurring. And then the last thing I'll say is, you probably encounter this if you're a retro gamer, where you're having trouble getting your games to read and the CD-ROMs aren't reading well. And, you're like, oh, my laser's going out. Well, the first recommendation you find a lot of times on the boards is go adjust the trim pot that handles the power going to the laser. Well, that's just covering up a problem. And what you're going to end up doing a lot of times is burning your laser out faster. It may fix it temporarily. A lot of these issues are actually driven off of bad capacitors or bad voltage to the CD-ROM itself. And there is a point where lasers got to get replaced. So you can mess with that if you want to, but I usually recommend you trying a recap, because it may just be capacitors need to be replaced. and that may fix all your problems without having to replace a laser. Do understand laser replacements are something that will occur on some consoles and will be needed. You can adjust that pot, but I would try other things first before getting into that, because you may worsen your problem and then completely burn out your CD drive. So with that, we can run through the different ones, kind of talk through some of the popular ones. Handheld, turning consoles that were meant for your living room into handhelds is another one. There's a whole underground scene around that too, if you really want to get into it.
It's starting to get big on the consoleized version. Kind of going, I looking at this list here, didn't even realize there was a Virtual Boy consoleizer, which should be good because those things give me a headache. But yeah, going up, like kind of you mentioned, you get your 3DO, kind of going down the list. You've got the OD, which we were talking about, the optical disc emulator, and then HDMI outs. So you're going to see a trend, like you mentioned, right? Like most of the stuff that they're doing the RGBs, but you got your OD for your Saturn as well. A lot of these, like the Saturn, you got your region-free BIOS. So right now, my Saturn, I actually have to have this little RAM card that I put in order to play Japanese Saturn games. And Bill, you just got yours too. Hopefully you've been enjoying yours.
Yeah, it seems to work well. I don't have any US games because mine is actually a Japanese console. So it goes both ways as long as I understand it correctly. So that's interesting that there's a plug and play option with that RAM cart to just plug it in and you're good to go playing both region games.
That's a non-invasive mod right there. It only costs you $35, but I'm pretty sure it's a little bit more in depth if you actually you solder it. It's just a chip you solder in, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Or a bypass or something.
Yeah, in the Sega Saturn, a lot of people wonder, because they're coming out with a lot of HDMI mods. There's no Sega Saturn HDMI mod out there at the moment. And it has to do with the way the signals run on the board. It's pretty complicated to get a pure digital signal with HDMI out. For me, the best way, if you're trying to get on a modern TV and get the Saturn to look good, the RAD2X cables are great. They work off of RetroTink technology. It pulls, I think RGB, and then it kind of steps it up so you can get it in HDMI. So there's not a lot of options if you want the super tricked out version. But I will say one of the cool things about the Saturn is the optical disc emulators. There is one that fits in the expansion slot. It's funny because it comes in this little box. It looks like a little like came from Japan with the little animals and stuff on it. And you can just put it right in there. So if you want it, that's one of the few ones where you don't have to actually pull out the old CD drive. You can keep it intact. A lot of those require it. So there are some good options out there, and hopefully one day we'll see a true digital video mod, but I think there are some challenges to overcome before we actually see that day. And the 3DO getting love is awesome, because not a lot of people talk about that, and the fact that somebody took the time to make an HDMI and an optical disc emulator, to me, is awesome. It allows people to actually open up to the library a little bit if you have a console.
Right. Yeah. I've only played a few games on 3DO. Gex and D. Those are the two. Anyway, I'm going on a tangent here. Right. Kind of continue on to, there's a lot of stuff for your signal on all these. And we could probably go in a whole episode on just all the technology that you mentioned. RetroTink, they make amazing products. And like I said, we could probably go on and talk about that for another hour, but kind of moving down here, you've got we had mentioned, NES mods. You have like your Open Nintendo, or like basically similar to the Game Boy. It's full redone boards, but the caveat is you have to move all of the parts over from your old board to the new one. And so that I started digging into those a little bit, and I'm like, I'm good. That's way too much work.
Bought everything to do one of those, and you basically, all the components are new except for like 2 or 3 chips. So the only thing you have to actually steal off the old board is 2 or 3, and but you have to solder in the new ones. So a lot of them are just they're all through hole, so they're not hard to do.
PPU and the PPU, what is that? Just so people know what we're
the power supply board is what you're talking about. That's the easiest way. Or the PPU chip. Oh, you're talking about PPU chip.
The PPU chip, it's like 40 pin. And that's like your
brains.
Yes, yeah, that's your CPU of the NES. Yeah. So anything that I haven't dug too much of that. Is I don't have a station to pull to a solder sucker station to make those things a lot easier.
Yeah, if you have a desoldering gun, that makes things like that a lot easier. But also, on that, most of the components are going to be new, so you're just going to be soldering them direct first time into the new board. I do have a full kit. I'm intending to do that at some point on the NES. It's pretty interesting to me. You can build a new NES in 2023 or 4.
You need to film that, man. You need to you don't have to stream it. Just like get some video of that. That'd be awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, it takes a few hours, but as long as you source all the parts, that took me a while to get all the parts ordered, everything you need for
Especially if it's in the last couple of years. It's hard to get anything right now.
The NES is pretty resilient. Like, it doesn't have a lot of capacitor issues. The one thing I see a lot is they have this board attached to it, which handles your RF modulation and power input. Those tend to get rusted a lot. They have like a casing on there for shielding. You see that a lot with RF stuff to prevent what Bill was talking about earlier with the signal and all that getting all, fuzzy or whatever you want to call it. Common thing with RF. They've made a replacement finally for that. So if you're looking for a replacement of that board, you can actually get a new one if yours looks like terrible. They also have HDMI mods, although the NES HDMI mod has been sold out for an eternity. I have seen that there is some coming down the pipeline. So eventually, hopefully, we'll have some more. RGB mods are super popular, including that AV mod Bill was talking about for the top loaders. Nobody likes to play on RF anymore. It's just not a good technology. Yeah, I mean, you can basically have a new NES other than a chip or two. I mean, what more can you do to it at that point? And the one more, I'll touch on real quick. You mentioned Virtual Boy with the consoleizers. If you do have a Virtual Boy out there, I just want everyone to be aware there is an issue with those, basically the lenses that go in there, where the glue wears off over time. It's a similar issue that the original Game Boy had, where you start losing lines in the screen and then you have to kind of solder it back down. The board ribbon cables were glued to hold the joint after they were soldered, and a lot of them have the glues worn out and then they've lost solder connection at some point over time because they weren't soldered very well. So don't be surprised if you're missing lines or things that you need to do a permanent solder lenses. There are some good experienced people on eBay, of all places, that do that on a regular and are trustworthy and done tons of these. I'm sure there's people in the modding community, but I wouldn't trust just anybody to do that. Find somebody experienced. I did not do that myself. That's one of the few mods I did not do. I hired somebody to do it. It's a very thin ribbon cable. You could burn it really easy. So just be aware. It's pretty common on a lot of Virtual Boys to have to do that. Doesn't mean your Virtual Boy's dead if you're missing lines or images gone.
Yeah, that's I had one where the lenses didn't work, and apparently it's just a quick fix. So with stuff that I don't know, you're immediately kind of drawn to be like, oh no, it's dead. But really, just find people that love bringing that stuff back to life. I think that's a good suggestion. Is there's someone out there that would put in the time to bring this stuff back up to life. So moving on over here. So kind of you got NES mods, Super Nintendo mods, same. You've got your digital audio upgrades and RGB out. I don't think I've ever heard of a Voltar's 2 chip mod, but is that a display upgrade?
So it's actually really awesome. So Voltar, if you haven't heard of him, he's a modder out there. I really like his stuff, but understand some of his stuff gets a little adult oriented in the way he talks on his things. He makes a lot of innuendos and stuff like that. But I like that about that. I find him really funny and entertaining to watch when you're watching a 20-minute modding video. But he's invented a chip basically. So a lot of people seek out the one chip Super Nintendos because they have better video quality. Well, the 2-chip version has always been kind of frowned upon, but he's got this mod that's coming out soon that will basically correct most of the issues and improve the video signal on the 2 chips, so you can have comparable or better signal to what the 1 chip does video wise. That's kind of getting into the enthusiast level. The average person may not care at that level. But if you see them side by side, you can tell the difference between a 1 chip and a 2 chip. And this basically corrects that. Definitely a cool mod. I don't think it's hit the shelves yet, but if you're interested in that and you're always like, man, I wish I had a 1 chip SNES, there may be things to correct those issues.
Pull up the website. That looks interesting. Doesn't seem like it's too hard either. It's literally looks like it's six solder points, which I might be oversimplifying it.
No, most of his mods are like little boards and stuff that aren't too bad. He makes them reasonable for most people to do.
Gotcha. And in 64, kind of I think you're seeing a trend here. It's an HDMI upgrade or an RGB mod. Those are the big ones for N64. And then now we're kind of going into the disk-based type stuff.
I'm going to have to reprimand you because you skipped over the Genesis here. And don't be hating on my Genesis, all right?
There was nothing there. And you're right. I should have, because YouTube, of all people, should know more about the Genesis stuff than me.
It should just say, Steve, talk now. Just kidding. No, the N64, I will tell you one thing, and then I'll talk about Sega Genesis real quick. But N64, they are coming out with an analog N64 in the future here. So it's very expensive to get the HDMI modded consoles. They're awesome. I've done a couple of them. I've done one for me, some for some friends. They're not easy to do. You got to solder these little ribbon cables to the CPU chips. I don't recommend those for beginner mods. They sell for a ton of money on eBay because of the difficulty in doing the mod. But Analog putting out an N64 digital version is surprising because we've never really had anything like that. And I think that will resonate, especially if it's a couple $100 versus the $600, $700, $800 people are getting for these HDMI modded things on eBay. Definitely be interesting coming down the line. And then the Sega Genesis. So for a long while, there weren't a lot of Genesis mods. There were like RGB stuff, those type of mods. There is the triple bypass mod, which is awesome. And the whole goal of the triple bypass mod is pulling some of the signals off the circuit to remove some of the noise. There was quite a bit of variance between the Model 1 and even the versions of the Model 1 out to the Model 2 and the Model 3. The sound quality was not the same. The video quality can differ a little bit. The most coveted is the original Model 1s that have the high definition graphics on the outside of the console. Well, if you do a triple bypass mod, while it does require some work and it's maybe a moderate level difficulty, it corrects a lot of those issues by running the circuitry through different areas. And you can have that great video and audio quality out of any of the console versions, basically, with that. So to me, that's one of the best ones to consider out there. If you're really a true Sega Genesis enthusiast, you want to have original components, and that'll also take care of your RGB output stuff as well. And there is an HDMI mod coming. Someone's finally made one after all these years for Sega Genesis. I'm not sure if it's out yet, but there is one in the pipeline if you want to go pure digital. There's other stuff out there for the Genesis, but to me, those are like some of the top ones to consider if you really want to have your Genesis, at the best that it can be. PS1 is just standard stuff like we talked about. HDMI mods, new power supplies. I personally like the old power supply. That was super well engineered by Sony. So I personally would rather recap it. But, like I talked about the voltage stuff to keep in mind, make sure you do your research on safety before diving into one of those. ODE drives are super, super popular for the PS1. The PS2 is kind of heading down the same track. They have some interesting things that have come out for it. For a long time, there wasn't a pure digital solution for PS2. It was basically what you had. It's starting to get into like more modern style electronics where everything's surface mounted. They're not easy. You may see some old ones that are like for playing backup games. There used to be old mod chips and stuff. Every now and again, you may stumble upon an old console that's been modded in that manner. But they have a hard drive mod. So those old hard drive adapters that also had the Ethernet connection for PS2. So that was really in the days that we were starting to get like internet into a console. Xbox had that as well, options for it. And they have a thing called Free McBoot, which basically is a memory card flash. And so you get your hard drive in there, you install it with that Ethernet adapter, you put your Free McBoot memory card in there, and you can install basically custom firmware. And that can actually allow the PS2 to output in HD, which is crazy to me. Without anything, you can go out in 1080. I can't remember if it's I or P, but the console was capable of doing that with the right technology, and somebody somehow cracked all this, which is crazy. But the Free McBoot adds a lot of new options. I'm not saying everything can run like that, but some things can. And then recently, the retro gem kits came out. Been a little bit of controversy in the retro community over those. just because they basically software locked it. You can buy 2 tiers. You can buy tier 1, which includes the basic revision, and tier 2 comes with all the software options and improved features that everybody wants. And it's like $100 difference between the two. So some people are like, why are you doing that? And like just upcharging. But also there's a lot of development time in there. So I have no issue with that. I bought a retro gem for my PS2 that I'll be putting in at some point. It's the first true digital HDMI out, and it looks amazing. The PS2 is that era where they start to, the graphics really start to look awesome when you get them in pure digital HD. Outside of those, I mean, those are the big ones. You know, the hard drives can run booted ROMs if you have FreeMcBoot on there. If you're looking for kind of the optical disc style setup, that'll work that way. But yeah, PS2, very popular console for its time.
This is where I'm getting way outside my realm of expertise on this stuff. But definitely Xbox, that was my first like disc-based console, I think. And now that I'm looking, I've got 2 Xboxes. I'm looking at some of these mods, and I'm like, man, maybe I could probably do a Project Stellar if my Xbox isn't destroyed from the cap leak. And that's something maybe we should talk about. Like we mentioned earlier, Xboxes are notorious for the power supply caps to leak. And there are 2 that you're supposed basically. I remember doing some research when I first picked up a couple. Immediately to open it up, and there's 2 capacitors that you need to remove, which that's for the real-time clock, right? That was I don't know, Bill or Steve, you guys have heard of that?
Yeah, the clock cap is the one, and depending on the revision of model you have for Xbox, you don't need to replace it. Some you do, some you don't.
Yeah, so I just remember one of mine being one of them, and I was like, oh, I'll do it later. Well, now I won't even boot. So it turns on and turns right back off. So I'm pretty sure when I crack that guy open, it's going to have some caps leaking all over it. And I don't even know if there's a fix at that point or if it's just pretty much dead.
They're pretty resilient. So what you're going to run into there is you're going to go in there, you're going to find a big pool of like rusty looking fluid probably because it gets nasty on the Xbox when it does leak. You're going to pull the caps out. There may be so much fluid that it's just shorting itself out at that point. That's the ideal situation. The less ideal would be if it got under something and it ended up like eroding through a board trace or something, and then you would have to repair the trace. But odds are,
I'm falling.
Yeah, odds are if you open it up, you take the caps out. I would clean it first before you start melting any of that goop and crap, and then pull them out, put new ones in. It may well function. It may have lost so much fluid it may not even be able to work properly too at that point. You don't want to leave any electrolytic fluid behind. It's electrically conductive.
That's yeah. So there's that, and I mean that's kind of a repair / mod, but and also the Project Stellar, which is really good, but it's essentially its own OS leveraging the hardware of the Xbox, and it has its new OS, can load games. I believe it's got internet support, and there's a lot of kind of going on the software side of things. There's a group of people that's actually reviving the original Xbox Live, and I've been following up on that, and I'm like, man, I would love to play some old Phantom Dust on. I don't know if you guys. It's very not so well known game, but it's an amazing game on Xbox Live.
That's a game that I intended to pick up, and then all of a sudden, some YouTuber threw it on a list, and it shot up out of nowhere from like $15 to $100. I'm like, this is ridiculous.
It was 20 new. And then I remember that same thing. I'm like, I have 2 copies of this game. Why is this so expensive now? It's just such a cool game.
It is a cool game, but it's not for everybody. And it's not a game that's going to have the staying power for, I mean, it's great if you like that type of game, but it's not going to have the staying power with a lot of individuals. So I knew as soon as that spiked up due to the YouTube phenomenon that happens from time to time with hidden gem videos, I go, it's going to come back down. If you look at the chart on price chart and it goes straight up and it's coming straight down and it hasn't like slowed down
right now.
Yeah. Well, that one's a little different.
So you've seen it too. There's people on Facebook and, for one, you don't go on a Facebook retro gaming collective group and try to sell this game that's on a bubble. It's so funny watching these people they're just getting destroyed by the community. And I'm kind of like, hey man, just put it on eBay and you'll sell it. Don't don't bring this over here because these guys are gonna have a field day with you. I feel bad for them, but it's hilarious too because you're like. And for those that don't know, basically they've discovered an exploit, maybe on Alien Resurrection that essentially, if you put in a code, it allows you to. It basically allows you to play burnt games on an unmodded PlayStation 1.
Yeah, it was intended to be a test for booting because they were originally going to make it multiple disc game. And so they were going to test out like, hey, can we boot in another disc? And they left it in there and nobody knew about it until the developer said something about it recently. And now people are like, man, I got to have this disc so I can boot my games. You can use it literally to boot any game you want. You just got to be able to hold the disc tray, I think, open or whatever with the button. So it's one of those weird things. I don't think that's going to be something that people really care about in the long run. It's going to have a permanent price jump, but I don't know. I wouldn't pay $300 this going for right now.
Shoot, $350, man. It's wild. Hold on. I'm looking it up right now to see where it's at.
Here's my thoughts on that. Right. So if you watch the video, I was getting dizzy and confused about a minute into it. It makes the Konami code look like child's play. I mean, it's, turn the game on, type in 14 different button presses with your PS1 controller, hold the L1 button, put your little cardboard piece in the disc tray so the disc keeps spinning, quick pull it out, put a different one, put a burn disc in. I mean, I don't know. That was just my take on it. It's just a little ridiculous, but definitely a niche thing that somebody is just nerding out on completely right now. And I guess it's kind of cool that we discovered it.
Yeah, I think you would just install one of the mods instead of messing with all that stuff. There's plenty of things out there nowadays.
And do that in pocket $200 because the mod's not going to cost you $340.
No, it's not at all. And so just to touch back on Xbox real quick. Yeah, Xbox has an awesome community. I mean, a lot of Xbox and enthusiasts are also PC enthusiasts. They're kind of built off the same mentality coming from Microsoft. And I love what Microsoft's all about with the Xbox too, even the newest ones. It's like, hey, we're going to make all our generations compatible all the way back to our newest console. So if you don't want to go back to the original Xbox, you can go ahead and play a number of Xbox and Xbox 360 games on a Series X. They went ahead and put that all in there, and they're turning it more into a PC, like where you have Steam. You can go buy old games, you can buy new games. That's the whole idea behind it. There is some licensing and other challenges to that, so they can't make every game compatible. So they do have a pretty widely published list of what is able to be played, but that's no mods, and you can still play your old retro games. And Xbox hasn't changed the controller that much. It's still pretty nice controller. And the Project Stellar kind of, you can bundle that. That's basically a board that goes into the Xbox, and it works in conjunction with Xbox HD Plus, which is a HDMI mod. That one's a little more difficult to install. You also have to install the OpenXenium mod chip as part of this process. But like Rom said, there's a lot of new features that adds to you, a whole new custom OS built off the original. You got HD support for all the things you want. And then the other one that's really popular, even if you're doing no mods, is the fan mods. They have some really awesome fans out there now that are super quiet, super powerful. And Xbox, for instance, runs variable speed, so it'll regulate. And in the custom interfaces and things, I think you can actually adjust the speeds at which your cooling is at. So you can actually improve the cooling and performance a little bit just by changing out the fan. And GameCube has a similar upgrade as well. Noctua is the popular one, and they sell 3D brackets to fit them in, so they fit like almost looking stock.
And that's what I use in my Noctua fans, and what I use on my PCs at home. They're good. They're good quality. They're worth the extra money. I guess kind of moving in GameCube, and I actually I had a buddy that a GC loader on it, the Picoboot, not GC, the Picoboot, and the thing is it's just a little Raspberry Pi that just, I mean, it's the Pi W or just the, not the W even. It's amazing. I had no clue that they had this type of mod for a GameCube, and it didn't take much for them to do it.
No, I thought that was awesome. So like Raspberry Pis have really opened the doors to a lot of electronic modding in general. And it uses the little small Raspberry Pi that's like super cheap. And it's just a program that runs and then you install the Raspberry Pi into the GameCube and it's able to run Pico Boot, which allows you to boot games either physically or off a SD card. So somebody figure that out, and it's super popular right now. I mean, I think that came out within the last year or so. It's great. And then they also have a number of there's also the GC loader out there too. That's another option. Although I think Pico Boots pretty much dominated the market after that came out. And then there's HDMI mod out there. I personally would not do an HDMI mod on a GameCube. And I say that because GameCube is new enough that it already has digital signal out. So there's a number of things like the Carby, GCHD that basically are adapters that you plug into the back of the GameCube. You need to have a digital compatible one. Those are the ones that have two video outs. One's digital and one's regular. And you just plug and play basically, and then it's HDMI out from there. The board does the rest. So you get it pure 480p digital. And from there, you can plug it in. If you want to upscale it, you can plug it in any upscaler that you want out there. I have, I forget the name of that thing. I got one of those HDMI upscaler, the digital ones that improves the video quality. Rom, you remember what those things are called? It's a little stick that takes like 480p to 1080p or 1080p to 4K.
Man, I actually just bought one. I don't recall the name. I can pull it up, but yeah, and I've used them. They work pretty well on my GameCube. I'm actually using one for the GameCube, and it's definitely not like a super high quality, expensive one. But Retrovision, right, Bill? We were talking about that.
The M Classic.
The M Classic. Okay.
So the M Classic can go all the way up to 4K. It depends on what kind of signal it gets in, but it also does graphic smoothing. So those jaggies you get on the GameCube and stuff, it makes it look crisper. You can even use it on modern stuff. It improves the look of a Nintendo Switch games too. It has some graphical features built into it. It's more than just an upscaler.
Oh, I thought. See, okay, I'm looking now. That's interesting. Yeah, there's so many little things.
It really makes the GameCube look nice. It makes the Dreamcast look awesome if you plug one of those in after an HDMI mod on the Dreamcast. But the fact that GameCube has a digital out, just get a digital out console to me and pick up. I use the Carby. The GCHD is too expensive to me for what it does, and they both run the same software on them. So I like the Carby personally, but there's a couple options out there for converting to HD. And while we're talking about that too, there's a lot of options for HD cables. A lot of people are just like, hey, what's my cheap option? I want to go on a modern TV. There's like pound cables and other stuff. It's hit or miss. And remember, if you're spending $30, you're going to get a $30 product. It'll work. It'll look better than your AV cables, but it's not going to do any miracles. There is a pretty big difference between an internal HDMI mod and vice versa. So depends on what makes you happy. Are you happy with just having reasonable, decent video coming through on an HD TV, or do you want to have that crisp, perfect digital signal? That's personal choice there. And what's your budget too? There's nothing wrong with them, but do your research because there is a wide variety of quality on cables. Not all cables are the same. Those HDMI ones, some are much better than others. There's a lot of good YouTube videos.
Even down to lower quality cables. Bill and I were talking about were they Retrovision, Bill, that we were?
Yeah, HD Retrovision it's called.
Yeah.
They're available on all your, standard retro sites, Stone Age Gamer, etc. But yeah, they're like $60.
Yeah, so they're the more higher quality and they work pretty well. I have one on my CDX right now, 2-component, and I do notice a difference. So, and that's kind of where I sit because I've got my CRT over here. But yeah, it's crazy the amount of stuff because most people don't have a CRT TV back here. I have a few. Steve, how many CRTs do you have?
I own only 2 CRTs, but I say that with a caveat. The one CRT I do not use, it's a small one. It came with my Sega Genesis kiosk that I have, the old store kiosk. And I swapped. Well, it's not the original. Somebody swapped it at one point. Otherwise I would have left it in there. but I did pick up a PVM Sony monitor that has already been recapped and calibrated in recent times. That's the same size as what went in the Genesis kiosk. So the video quality on my Genesis kiosk is going to be amazing when I finally get it all fixed up. I got to do some work on the soundboard. But I really don't play on CRTs. I'm a digital guy as far as playing. I like the HDMI mods. I have no problem whatsoever doing them, and I like having that clear signal. But I will tell you one thing. Somebody pointed out recently, like especially like on the Genesis, the games counted on like dithering and stuff, where those little jagged edges will kind of blend in to make it look different. So if you play it on a digital screen versus a CRT, it will have a slightly different feel to it than it was originally. And some consoles more so than others. And that made it, it was designed with that intended, with the CRT look.
Yeah, a comment. You're talking about like the waterfalls on Sonic, right, Steve?
Yeah, or like there'll be a bush like in a background, and the bush will be all jagged edges. It's like, okay, that's a funky looking bush. But if you were to see that on a screen, the colors from those little dots would have blended in from the green to the green, so it would have looked more cohesive than just a little jagged.
Yeah, the Genesis was the developers for the Genesis especially were very creative to get kind of trick your eyes into seeing things differently. Like they did a really good job with the dithering and different effects like that for sure. And yeah, with CRTs real quick, we could almost have a full episode on HD versus CRT. So I play for both teams, right? So I have a Mega SG, so I enjoy playing full 1080 Genesis games. But then I also have like 5 CRTs. I think I only have like 3 in the house right now, but
he's got 2 hidden somewhere.
Right. Well, I've got one sitting right behind me, but that's not in use. But I have like a 9-inch, like a really tiny one, and then I've got as big as like a 36-inch Toshiba, like late 2003, kind of more later bubble tube that was a pretty high dollar TV when in its day. So so component options there for sure. That's why I was looking into the HD Retrovision cables. But so that's just kind of like if you don't want to get too far in the weeds with modding, that's just a simple thing you can do to improve your quality is, something like the cables is an option too.
Like you mentioned, the you get what you pay for. And then I'm learning that because I've got like 3 or 4 things on here returned to Amazon. So I've been just trying different things, and the last thing just doesn't even work. So it's interesting trying to figure all this stuff out, and hopefully we can shed some light on this and with some other, like you said, we should probably do a whole episode on just like the HD CRT type thing. There's a lot to unpack.
Well, one thing I'll say about like the modern HDMI mods and some of these, they have gone the extra mile to add in effects like scan lines, which does help make up. It's kind of what I would call a happy medium. You go in there, turn the scan lines on, it'll look much closer to the way it was intended to if you really, really want to see that. And some of the scan lines that they've created on some of these HDMI mods are really good. I mean, they really give you that CRT feel, and others are so. So mileage may vary. But at least if you like that old look, it'll give you a closer spot.
All right. So as we're closing up, I'll change it up with Bill first. Do you think that all these mods that we've talked about, do you think that it takes away from kind of like the allure or just the purity of retro gaming, or do you see it as more of like just a way to bring them into the current century, basically, to kind of help enhance the shortcomings of all the other consoles that were made, in the 80s, 90s?
Yeah. So I got a couple thoughts on that. So I originally, when I got into retro gaming again recently, 5 years ago, you plug you plug in something like an N64 to an HD television, and it's going to kind of turn you off to this retro gaming thing. I mean, it's not going to look good. So I think it's definitely like a good way to get new folks interested into the hobby. Honestly, is hey, you remember the Game Boy when you were a kid? Didn't look good. Well, guess what? They got brand new options of new screens and different stuff. So I think it's a really good way actually to pique interest of people that are not sure about this hobby and things like that. There's obviously still a place for, purists. I consider myself more of a purist as far as like, using original cartridges and CRTs, etc. But I mean, there's definitely lots of avenues you can take. You can go full blown one end, redoing your whole entire motherboard and adding all this fancy gear, or you can just do one simple little upgrade. So you can just dip your toes in if you want, or you can go all in. So I definitely am a proponent and think it adds to the hobby rather than takes away, for sure.
Gotcha. Yeah. Steve, your thoughts, and I'll give mine at the end here.
Well, considering I do a lot of modding, I'm definitely a proponent for it. I am a bit of a purist in the sense because I do like to play on original hardware. I mean, I like the form factor. When it comes to the Analog Pocket came out, I did not buy the Analog Pocket, even though it plays all those consoles, because I like the original form factor of my Game Boy. I like the original form factor of my Game Gear. I don't want to play that on the digital solution because I have great options available for screen replacements. Like the original Game Boy screens look great, those IPS models, and I can actually flip them to the green screen, and it can actually show you a green variant that looks very similar but better than the original. So if I want that old school look, I could still have it with more modern technology. So to me, they're enhancements. They're not really, getting away from the core of it. Like at the end of the day, there are a lot of people that are casual and not as big into it as us, and they want it just to look good on an HDTV. And the great thing is there are lots of options there. Even if you're just going to buy an analog console, great. You want to play on original cartridges, that's awesome. Go out there and do it. And I don't get why some people sometimes are pretty hard on people like, oh, it's not original because you changed all this stuff. But some stuff needs to be changed and some stuff needs to be fixed. And it's just improving a hobby that we all love and care about.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think I've always been kind of the middle of the road type of person with anything that could be a polarizing type thing, and I think there's room for both. Kind of the same reason why you didn't get an Analog Pocket is why I got the Analog Pocket. Is I think more so for me, I just love collecting the physical media. The form factor, like honestly, the Game Gear is just it's a little too out here for me. But I've started playing more Game Gear games, and I love playing it on my Pocket more. So I've got the adapter that allows you to play Game Gear games. So as I'm collecting, I'm like, oh man! Like I was just playing last night. I was playing Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine, and it's on my Analog Pocket. I just put it in the adapter and go. But I do I do console mod, and I love my modded DMGs. So to me, it's just more the collecting aspect, and how I display it is how I display it, right? So, and it's like you said, some people agree, some people disagree, but I definitely believe there can be like a happy medium between it all. Like, can't we just all get along? That's all I got to say. Just in life, in general.
I think you brought up a great point. A lot of us are cartridge original media collectors, but when it comes to the consoles, we're willing to upgrade and improve the experience, but we want that original cartridge. I would say these optical disc emulators are not for the collectors. Those are for the casualists that are just trying to play some games. I'm not big on emulating. I own every game that I have backed up. I don't, download emulation, and I'm not big on that, but there are casual people out there that do, and that's how they experience their retro games. So, definitely a division there between the two, consoles versus original games.
Right. Now, in collecting the physical stuff, and I'm 100% with you up until I started thinking about wanting to collect for Sega CD and Saturn. And then I'm like, ODEs sound good because some of these games, like I was looking, someone on Facebook was posting Kyo Flying Squadron. They're like, man, this is a good price. It's only $2,200 for a Sega CD game. So it's getting to the point where some of those games I'm just like, man, it's getting crazy. But I still want that physical, the physical stuff. You know what I mean? And that could be a whole other. We keep saying everything could be a whole other episode just to kind of go and talk about. Well, that about wraps up the show for us today, and thank you for tuning in. We could go on for another 2-3 hours just talking about different mods, but hopefully you found some of this stuff interesting. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions about any sort of modding type issues you might be having. I'm sure between the three of us, some of us can help you out, or at least direct you to some other resources.
Just to close out, we are on Facebook, Instagram, we're on X, formerly known as Twitter. So there's a lot of different ways you can reach out to us. I'll post some basic modding tools that I recommend, as well as the stuff that I use. So if you think about venturing out and you've been listening in and want to try this out, feel free to message us if it's a more specific question. So thanks for tuning in, everyone.